The carriage that delivered her to the Duke's house did not slow. It came at the gallop up the spring-soft drive of Ashbourne Hall, two greys foaming at the bit, sent at speed and with intent by the Duke's worst enemy. The coachman wrenched them to a halt only when the gravel crunched under the front wheels of the great house's portico. Lillian Marsh had her hand on the door before the step was down. She did not wait for the footman. She did not wait for permission. She stepped out into the late April afternoon in a travelling cloak the colour of old amber, a single small trunk at her feet, and she handed the porter a sealed letter, the seal pressed in red wax with the device of the Marquis of Rendlesham, the Duke's enemy these 3 years past. And she said, in a voice that no one expected to be steady, "I am the payment, sir. I am sent by the Marquis in part settlement of his debt to your master, and I will not be returned." The porter blinked at her. He was a tall, sandy-haired countryman of perhaps 50, in the dark green livery of the Ashbourne household, and the smell of the boot room still clung faintly to his coat. He turned the letter once in his hands, registered the seal, and the colour of his face changed by precisely 1 degree. "Be so good," she said, "as to inform the Duke that the Marquis sends his apologies for the debt of £40,000, and sends me in part settlement." She watched him work through the unfamiliar arithmetic of how a young woman might be a part settlement, and finding it refused to balance. She did not help him. The light had the silvered softness of late April after rain. Above the porch, swallows had begun to nest under the eaves, a sound she had not heard for 5 years, because the eaves at Rendlesham Park had been netted against just such untidiness. She closed her eyes for one short instant against the brightness, then made her face calm, and waited for the porter to remember he had a master. The Duke of Ashbourne came down the front steps 11 minutes later. Lillian watched him before he saw her. A tall man, broad through the shoulders, 27 and new to his title, his dark coat unbuttoned, as though he had walked out without remembering the cuffs. He was reading the letter for the second time. She knew because his thumb had paused on the same line. When he reached the bottom of the steps, he raised his eyes to her face and stopped. "You are not a debt," he said. "I have been informed I am, Your Grace." "Then you have been informed incorrectly." His voice was lower than she had braced for, and steadier, and it almost made her forget the parchment sewn into the lining of her cloak between her shoulder blades. She felt the stiffness of it against her skin like a second spine. 6 pages. The work of 5 years. "My lord," she said, "I cannot go back." "You will not go back," he answered. "But neither will you stay as a debt. Come inside, Miss Marsh, before the household watches us argue about it." He turned. She followed. The hall was high and pale-stoned, with daffodils on a side table in a plain blue earthenware jug no Rendlesham housekeeper would ever have permitted. "My mother prefers the kitchen vases," the Duke said. "I should not like to be Mrs. Halford." "No one should." He took her into a small receiving room where the fire had been lit against the spring damp, set the letter face down on the writing table as though refusing to look at it again, and poured her a glass of something amber from a decanter. She accepted it. She did not drink. She watched him. "Tell me what you understand of the situation, Miss Marsh." She understood that the Marquis of Rendlesham owed him a sum he would not pay, and that she had been offered in lieu of approximately a quarter of it, a transfer of guardianship from the Marquis to the Duke, with her dowry rolled into the settlement. She understood, also, that he found the arrangement repugnant. "So do I," he said. The Duke set down his own glass without drinking from it. "What age were you when the Marquis took your guardianship?" 18. "And now?" 23. 5 years. 5 years. He let that lie between them on the table next to the letter. "Why," he said carefully, "did he send you?" She looked at him. She had practiced this answer in the carriage between Bath and the Wiltshire boundary stones, and at Devizes, and at Marlborough while the horses were changed. Now, in the warm receiving room at Ashbourne Hall, she discovered she had no use for the practiced version. She put her glass down. "He sent me," she said, "because he believes I am worthless. A quiet, unaccomplished girl who reads too much and complains too little, and that to lose me will cost him a salary, a chamber, and his pride. He is correct in 3 of these assumptions." "Which 3? "The salary, the chamber, the pride." "And the 4th? "Your Grace," said Lillian, "I am not what he sent." She watched the Duke understand her precisely. He looked at her for a long moment, in which the only sound was the fire, then sat down opposite her and said, "Then we will need to be very careful about how I refuse you." She agreed. The Marquis could not suspect she had come on terms other than his, and she could not return. For the moment, she was not the payment, but his mother's guest, and would speak to no one of London, Rendlesham, debt, or why she came. And before evening, he added, she would tell him what was in the lining of her cloak that she kept touching when she thought no one was watching. She had not known she was touching it. She put her hand down very carefully on her knee and acknowledged him. He stood. He bowed. He crossed to the door and paused with his hand on the latch and looked back at her. "You are welcome to Ashbourne, Miss Marsh. The library is on the 1st floor, the 2nd door on the right. Mrs. Halford will hate that you went there before your chamber. I find I do not." He left. Lillian sat very still and thought, he saw the cloak in 11 minutes, and he is not going to ask until I am ready to tell him. She felt, for the first time since the carriage door had closed on her in Berkeley Square, the edge of something she had not let herself feel for 5 years. Hope. Then she stood, and she went to find the library. Mrs. Halford caught her on the landing, a small grey woman with a face like an account book closed for the week, and informed her that her room was on the 2nd floor. Lillian replied that the Duke had directed her to the library first. Mrs. Halford said he would never. Lillian answered, with a careful smile, that he had done so today for the first time, and asked for her trunk to be taken up. She went on. The library faced south. Late sun came through the great Palladian window in long, warm bars, and the smell of beeswax and old leather hit her with such force she closed her eyes for a heartbeat in the doorway. She moved through the shelves the way a sailor moves through a familiar harbour. She was not, in fact, looking for a book. She was looking for the Duke's account ledgers. The Marquis kept his locked in a strongbox in his bookroom, because he had something to hide. A man whose accounts were honest left them on a shelf. The first thing she had needed to know about the Duke was where in his house he kept his books. On the 3rd shelf of the west wall, between Coke's reports and a volume on Fenland drainage, she found 3 buckram-bound quarto ledgers with the Ashbourne arms tooled into the spine, and she took the most recent down with the gentleness of a woman hoping no one will walk in. Someone walked in. "Miss Marsh." The Duke had changed his coat. He stood in the doorway in dark bronze, and she registered that he had come deliberately to see what she did with her quarter of an hour. "Your Grace." "You have my ledger, Miss Marsh." "I do." "Why?" She set it open on the reading table. The Ashbourne accounts were kept honestly, on a shelf where anyone could find them, and she felt an absurd relief. "Your Grace," she said, "your wine merchant has been overcharging you on the carriage of the Madeira since last Michaelmas." A pause. He begged her pardon. His factor, Mr. Penrose, she assumed, was paying £3 8 the dozen for cartage from Bristol, when the standard rate to Wiltshire houses was £2 2. The man had been pocketing the difference. She set her finger on the column. Here, here, and here. She lifted her eyes to him. He had not moved from the doorway. It was not a great sum, she said. She should not have mentioned it. She had no business looking at his ledger, and she apologized. He said her name. She said his title. He asked how long it had taken her to find that. I noticed it when I opened the book. A long, long silence. Sit down, Miss Marsh, said the Duke. I find I would like a great deal more of my afternoon than I had planned. She sat. The Duke crossed the library and sat opposite her. He looked at her hand on the column, then at her face. Miss Marsh, he said, whatever you are not what Rendlesham believes he sent. I am not. How long did the Marquis keep you in his house? 5 years. Doing what? Living quietly, said Lillian. Reading. Being unremarkable. Eating cold soup at the foot of his table because that is where one sits when one is the daughter of his late wife's penniless cousin. And learning, slowly, every shape and weight of how the Marquis keeps his books. The Duke went very still. He asked why. Because at 18, Your Grace, I believed him an honourable man. At 19, I no longer did. At 20, I understood no one else was in a position to know what I knew. At 21, I began my own private record, in pencil, in the margins of a book of sermons no one ever opened. At 23, I sewed it into the lining of a cloak. She did not touch the cloak. She did not have to. The Duke's eyes had already gone there. Miss Marsh, he said, very softly. What is in that lining? 6 pages, Your Grace. Of what? Of his frauds. The fire shifted. Somewhere below, a bell rang for tea. The Duke did not turn his head. He told her she understood what she had just told him. She said she understood it perfectly. He warned her that if Rendlesham learned what she had brought into his house, he would not stop at calling in a debt. Your Grace, the debt is the smallest of his concerns. The 40,000 is a feint. He owes the East India Company nearer 212,000, and the company has begun to ask questions he cannot answer. He sent me to clear one obligation and rid himself of the only inconvenient witness in his household at one stroke. He had not been, the Duke answered. He had very nearly been, she said. Almost. But he had made one error. The Duke asked what error. He did not believe a young woman with cold soup in front of her could read the books on his desk while he was in London. The Duke looked at her for a long, slow moment, and Lillian, watching him, felt the parchment in her cloak warm against her shoulder blades for the first time in 5 years. Miss Marsh, I do not yet know what I will do with you, but you will not eat cold soup in this house. You will sit at the head of the table tonight, beside my mother. Tomorrow morning, after you have slept and eaten, you will come back to this room and bring me, page by page, 6 pages of frauds. We will read them together, and we will decide, together, what we do. She accepted, twice, quietly. Together, he said. It was the second time he had used the word. Mrs. Halford opened the library door with the vigor of a housekeeper who has found a young woman alone with the master of the house at 4:30. She announced that tea was served. The Duke replied, "In 10 minutes." Mrs. Halford withdrew. The door clicked. The Duke leaned back, and for the first time since Lillian had stepped from the carriage, he smiled. It was a small smile, directed at the ledger rather than at her face, but she saw it. He told her Rendlesham had done him a tremendous favour. She prompted him. He said the Marquis had sent him the precise person he needed. Lillian, who had learned to keep her face expressionless, could not quite manage it now. The Duke looked up and saw the small, unguarded thing cross her face before she put it away. He did not remark upon it, but something in his own face softened. He repeated, "Tomorrow, after she had slept." She agreed. Tonight, he added, he would be obliged if she would survive his mother. Lillian replied she would endeavour to. The Duke told her she would not need to endeavour. His mother adored anyone who annoyed Mrs. Halford. He stood and bowed. He did not offer her his arm, the conventions had not yet caught up, but held the door, and in the corridor he said, very quietly, 5 years. 5 years, Your Grace. I am sorry, Miss Marsh, for every cold soup. She did not answer him. She did not need to. She had not, in 23 years, expected anyone to apologize for the soup. Tea was served in the green drawing room. The Dowager Duchess was a tall, thin woman of 53, with iron-grey hair and a quick-moving mouth. She pronounced that Edmund's Miss Marsh was intelligent, and that Mrs. Halford would hate her. The Duke replied that Mrs. Halford had begun. "Excellent," said the Dowager, and asked if she rode. No. They would remedy it. Did she read? Yes. English, French, Latin, a little Italian. She had hoped to learn Greek, but had had no master. The Dowager declared she should have her late husband's Greek master, 71, in Salisbury, and board. Edmund was instructed to write to Dr. Marchmont before dinner. More tea? Lillian accepted. The Dowager poured with the concentration of a woman who had decided the rest of the afternoon belonged to her. The Duke caught Lillian's eye over his mother's shoulder and held it for one careful beat. She understood the beat. The dramatic events of the day, said his eyes, are not over. But for the moment, they would be still. By morning, the rain had cleared. Lillian woke at 6:30 in a yellow chamber with windows onto the kitchen gardens, and lay still trying to think how she had come to wake here instead of the cold north room at Rendlesham Park. Then she rose, washed, put on her plainest dove-grey gown, and went down to the library, the travelling cloak folded over her arm. The Duke was already there. He stood at the window with his back to the door, a cup of coffee in his hand, and a letter in the other, and he did not turn when she came in. He told her to close the door, Miss Marsh. She did. He has written. Rendlesham? Within 12 hours of your arrival. The post-rider must have been on the road before you reached the Wiltshire boundary. What does he say? The Marquis hoped, said the Duke evenly, that he was finding her suitably grateful. He noted that she was, by nature, retiring, that the Duke should not be offended by her silences, that she was fond of the colour blue, and that, should the Duke wish to return her for a fuller settlement, the Marquis would be pleased to substitute her cousin, Miss Hortensia, who was plumper. She observed that he had never written that letter in 12 hours. The Duke agreed. He had written it before she left. He was testing whether the Duke had refused her, and whether she had spoken. She confirmed it. The Duke set the letter down and turned from the window. The morning light caught the side of his face. Show me the lining, Miss Marsh. She unfolded the cloak. She turned it inside out and laid it flat on the reading table. The lining was old amber silk, hand-stitched, with a long row of stitches 1/4 inch apart. She picked up a paper knife, looked at him for permission, and worked it along the seam, drawing out 6 pages folded into 8, creases soft from age. She did not need to look at them. She had memorized them 3 years ago. Page 1, she said. The Hampshire grain transactions. He told the company he had bought 12,000 quarters of wheat in 1814 for £19,000. He bought 8,000 for 11. The remaining 11,000 he attached to a phantom 7th ship of the East India Fleet, which has appeared in his returns every season since. He told her to stop. She stopped. You are giving me the contents of the page from memory. I am. The Duke stared at her. He said her name, and she answered with his title. He told her to sit down. She sat. He offered coffee. She accepted. He poured. His hand was not entirely steady. It had been the day before, and she filed the change away. He sat down across from her and told her to begin again, slowly. She began again. The library clock ticked. By 9:30, she had finished the first 3 pages, and the Duke had stopped writing because he had stopped needing to. A footman came in with fresh coffee, and the Duke said, "Out," without taking his eyes from her. At 10:30, she finished the 6th page, and said that was what she had. The Duke said it was enough to ruin him. She corrected. It was enough to put him in a cell, Your Grace, if any of these papers could be got to the East India Company before he learned that they existed. And if he learns? He will burn his books in the next 48 hours, deny everything, and the company, who do not love bad publicity, will let him quietly retire to Kent. 3 of his stewards will suffer the law. Nothing will change. And you? I should not advise being in the Marquis's house when he learns. You will not be in his house. She looked at him. She looked at his face. She found nothing in it she could read, and so for a moment she let herself look anyway, simply because looking at him was, surprisingly, no hardship. No, Your Grace, she said. I expect I will not. He smiled. It was the second time. This time it touched his eyes. Miss Marsh, he said, we are going to need a plan. They worked all morning, through luncheon the Dowager had sent up, and into the afternoon. At 3, the Duke's man of business arrived from London, a small, dark man named Peregrine Strake, whom the Duke introduced. Strake, this is Miss Marsh. She knows more of the Marquis of Rendlesham's accounts than the Marquis of Rendlesham. Believe everything she tells you. Strake bowed, as though to a queen. Her voice would not arrive in her throat for a second. The Duke saw it, and did not remark. She sat down and reached for her coffee. They worked until the lamps were lit. Strake took the 6 pages with him in a leather case that did not leave his hand, and at the door he paused. He told the Duke he would reach London by 8 in the morning, and would need 3 days. The Duke gave him 2. Strake accepted. Strake, said the Duke. Yes, Your Grace? It must not be possible to trace these to Miss Marsh. Not in any document, deposition, or conversation. The papers came to me from a clerk in Bristol who has since vanished. Rendlesham must believe that. The company must believe it. I will not have her name in this. Strake bowed his agreement. Strake left. Lillian had been standing very still in the middle of the library. She began to thank him. He said he had needed to. She told him the Marquis would guess. He had sent her here. The Duke agreed he would guess. He would not, however, be able to prove. There was a difference. Your Grace, if he so much as suspects Miss Marsh. The Duke crossed to her. He did not touch her, but he stood close enough that she registered the bronze of his coat, the smell of bergamot from his shaving water, and the warmth of him in the cooling library. He's not going to come anywhere near you. She told him the Marquis was coming, himself within a week to see whether she was still here. The Duke confirmed both. She asked what he would do. I will receive him as a friend of the family. I will give him an indifferent dinner. I will introduce him to my mother. By the time he leaves, the East India Company will already know what they need, and his ruin will be in motion in London before his carriage clears my park. She said the Marquis would know. The Duke answered, not until it was finished. She said he would look at her at the dinner, and he would look at her and he would know. Miss Marsh, Your Grace, you will not be at the dinner. She told him she would. A silence. Miss Marsh, said the Duke, I am asking you to remain in your chamber that evening. And I am refusing, Your Grace. The Duke of Ashbourne, who had spent the morning watching her speak 6 pages of fraud from memory, looked at her now with an expression she could not quite identify. It was not anger. It was something much harder to name. He asked why. Because for 5 years he has eaten in front of me. Because he has eaten my cousin's dowry, and my father's house, and my own. My own! She stopped. She breathed. He sent me here to be a humiliation. If I am hidden upstairs while he eats your indifferent dinner, he will believe his humiliation has succeeded. If I am at your table, eating off your china, speaking to your mother as though I have always been there, he will spend the evening waiting for me to drop a fork, and I shall not. He will not know what I have done, nor what I am about to do. That is the only reckoning I am ever going to have with him in person. I will not give it up to be safe." She stopped. The library clock ticked. "Miss Marsh," said the Duke at last, "I withdraw my request." She thanked him. He asked what colour. She prompted him. He repeated, what colour would she wear? She thought about it. She had not thought about it. She found, with a small, dry shock, that the answer was already in her. "Ruby," she said. The Duke smiled. It was a slow smile, and it stayed longer than any before it. She thought, very calmly, that she was going to have to be careful. The Duke of Ashbourne smiling at her was not a thing she had considered when she had sewn 6 pages into a cloak 3 years ago. He said Ruby would do very well. The Marquis arrived on a Wednesday evening in the 2nd week of May. The hawthorn was in flower along the drive. Lillian dressed in the yellow chamber, with the help of a maid called Anne, once a milliner's apprentice in Bath, with the kind of fingers that persuade hair into new conclusions about itself. Anne asked whether she was certain about the ruby, since the Dowager Duchess had said the ruby. Lillian was certain. Anne warned that it was a colour that would be remembered. Lillian agreed. It was. Anne dressed her in deep ruby silk with cream lace at the sleeves, pinned her dark hair high, fastened a cream pearl drop at her throat, and stepped back. Miss did not look like a Miss Marsh tonight, she said. Lillian asked what she looked like. Anne answered, like a woman who is going to win something. Lillian looked at herself in the long glass. She looked like a woman who had spent 5 years eating cold soup, and had decided tonight to eat hot. The amber cloak was downstairs, locked in a Duke's study. The 6 pages were in London, in the offices of the East India Company. Strake had sent word. The company had received them, read them, and begun to move. She went down. The Duke of Ashbourne was waiting at the foot of the stair. He was in dark blue evening dress, very formally cut, and he watched her descend with an expression she filed away. She did not give him her hand. They were not engaged, and Mrs. Halford was watching. But he inclined his head to her, and she to him, and he said, for her ears only, "Steady." She answered, "Steady, Your Grace." He told her the Marquis had just come in. She had heard. He had not yet seen her, the Duke said. She replied that she should like the seeing to happen at the dinner table, if His Grace would permit. It would be his preference, he answered. Then, she said, it was hers. They went in. The Marquis, Lillian's guardian for 5 years, the man who had once made her stand in the rain at Rendlesham Park for speaking too freely of the price of bread, stood in the green drawing-room with a glass in one hand and an unconvincing smile on his face. He was handsome, in his middle 50s, broad-shouldered still, his hair graying becomingly at the temples, the looks of a man one would trust on first meeting and never on second. He was speaking to the Dowager about the unseasonable warmth of the evening when he saw Lillian come in. The room was lit by candles in the great chandelier and in branched silver pieces along the walls, and the warm light moved across the green silk hangings, pooling at the silver. The hawthorn outside the west window was so heavy with white blossom, the glass seemed full of cloud. Lillian had time, in the half-second before he turned, to register all of it. He stopped in the middle of his sentence. He did not stop for long. He was practiced. He recovered within a heartbeat, but the heartbeat was there, and Lillian had come precisely for the heartbeat, and the heartbeat was beautiful. "Marquis," said the Duke evenly, "you will recall Miss Marsh." The Marquis answered, of course. The Duke continued that she had been his mother's guest these 2 weeks, that Mamma had decided to take her in hand. Greek, riding, the management of an estate. The Marquis pronounced it delightful. He came forward. He took Lillian's hand. His grip was a degree firmer than was correct. He told her she appeared to be flourishing. She answered she was very well, and thanked him. He asked whether she had been keeping her usual habits, her reading, her sewing, her quiet observation of the lives of others. Her habits, she said, had continued. He was pleased to hear it. As, she said, was she. He held her hand a beat longer than was correct. She did not pull it away. She looked at him calmly and watched him try, in real time, to reconcile her with the cold soup ward he had put into a carriage 3 weeks before, and watched him fail. He released her hand. "The Dowager Duchess did fine work," he commented. He commended her on it. Lillian replied that the Dowager was a great patroness of small projects. The Marquis's smile flickered. He was not, she thought, used to being a small project. The Duke, behind her, did not smile, but she felt the shape of his amusement at her shoulder as plainly as she would have felt his hand there. Dinner was indifferent. The Duke had been specific with his cook. The mutton plain, the soup thick, the wine second quality. The Marquis ate it with an expression of fine breeding and growing concern. He had come to learn whether Lillian had been compromised, refused, returned, or kept. He had not come expecting indifferent mutton. In failing to identify the game, he began to make small mistakes. He drank too quickly. He spoke too much. He told the Dowager an anecdote about an estate in Hampshire that, Lillian noticed, he had never been near. She did not correct him. She had spent 5 years allowing his anecdotes. This one was particularly safe to allow. At one point, he turned to her and said he trusted she had written to him. She said she had not. He pressed. "No." "There has been very little to write. The library is excellent. The Dowager's company is generous. I have begun Greek. I had not expected to be so fully occupied." He asked whether she was homesick. "My lord," said Lillian, and she set down her wineglass with a particular gentleness. "I find I have a quite excellent capacity for being where I am." A small, perfect silence. The Dowager covered it. She was excellent at covers. Launching a topic involving the rebuilding of the South Lodge. The conversation moved on, and Lillian felt the Duke find her with one careful look across the silver. "Steady," said the look. "Steady," she answered with her eyes. After dinner, the gentlemen did not linger over their port. The Marquis had hoped to be alone with the Duke. The Duke came through to the drawing room in 12 minutes flat and placed himself at the Dowager's right hand, asking about lapidary, her great enthusiasm. She did not let go of either of them for 40 minutes. The Marquis retired at 11:20, outmaneuvered politely by a Duke of 27, his mother, and a girl in ruby silk. And he had not yet understood why. When the door closed behind him, the Dowager set down her embroidery. She did not like that man, she said, particularly the way he had looked at Miss Marsh, as though Lillian had once belonged to him, and he had momentarily forgotten where he had put her. She demanded to know what was going on. The Duke promised to tell her in the morning. She gathered her shawl, paused at Lillian's chair, and laid a thin, warm hand on her shoulder. "Good night, my dear. The ruby was correct." She went. Lillian was alone in the drawing room with the Duke. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire had burned down to red afterglow. The Duke crossed the carpet to her and stood looking down, and for a long moment she thought he was going to say something irrevocable, and was glad, terrifyingly glad, that he might. He told her Strake's letter had come up by the same post as the Marquis. She prompted him. "The company has issued the warrant." She stopped breathing. She asked, "Tonight?" He confirmed it. They would take him at his townhouse, he said. Observers had been waiting since the day before yesterday. He would not return to a house he could re-enter. She began to ask, and he finished it for her. Then it was finished, Miss Marsh. She sat down on the small couch. She had not realized her knees had stopped working. The Duke went to the fire and turned a log with the poker. The flame found a new edge of resin, and Lillian found her face was wet, and she had not noticed when it had become so. He spoke to her with his back still to the room, and asked whether she had eaten anything at dinner. "A little," she said. "Yes." He told her he thought she had not. She began to answer. He cut her off. No, she had not. Would she eat now? She told him she was not hungry. There is bread and butter and cold beef on the side table. You will eat. You have not eaten since breakfast. You have today watched the man who used you for 5 years eat your duke's mutton, and you have shown him the inside of your composure so calmly, I believe I shall one day write a treatise upon it. You will sit and eat, and you will not stand up again until I am satisfied. He did not turn from the fire while he said this. She was crying properly now. She had not cried in 3 years, possibly 4. She crossed to the side table because it was easier than disobeying him, and sat down where the butter was, and ate a piece of bread very slowly. The Duke turned from the fire, came over, and sat opposite. He served her a piece of cold beef onto her plate without a word. He said her surname. She answered with his title. Lillian. She raised her eyes to him. It was the first time he had used her name. It hung between them on the table, and she did not pick it up immediately. She was not yet equal to it. He saw her hesitate and said, very gently, "Eat." She ate. He cut her another piece. They ate in silence. He poured her a small glass of red wine, the good wine, and she drank it slowly. The fire shifted again. He said, eventually, "I owe you a confession of my own, Miss Marsh." She prompted him. He gave his Christian name, Edmund. She looked at him. "Edmund," she said, carefully, as one fits a key to an unfamiliar lock. He told her he had known of her before she arrived. His father, the late Duke, had kept correspondence with the Marquis. 3 years ago, in a letter that should not have gone where it went, the Marquis had referred to a young cousin of his late wife's, whom he found, and he quoted, "unsettlingly observant, and likely in time to be inconvenient." His father had underlined the sentence twice. He had thought about her, off and on, for 2 years. She looked at her plate. She began to ask. He answered before she finished. He had been prepared to find a quiet, intelligent young woman in a Rendlesham carriage. He had not been prepared to find what he had found. She asked which. He did not answer at once. "I am still finding out, Lillian." She picked up her glass. She did not quite drink from it. She looked at him over the rim, and she said, "I am also finding out, Your Grace." Edmund. Edmund. Eat your beef. She ate her beef. The next morning, Strake arrived at 10:30 and came directly to the library. The Marquis had been arrested at the door of his townhouse at 7:20. The company was in possession. 3 principal stewards had turned. The case would be heard within the term. Rendlesham Park was sealed. The Marquis's wards, Lillian and the cousin Hortensia, were to be moved to alternative trustees within the week. Strake asked where he should tell the Court of Chancery the wards might be sent. The Duke answered that Miss Marsh had chosen to be the guest of his mother for the present. "And Miss Hortensia?" he pressed. The Duke turned to Lillian and asked whether she knew her cousin. She knew her, Lillian said. The girl was 16, plump, fond of horses, and could not read French. Her mother was in Lyme. She would like to go to Lyme. The Duke instructed Strake, to Lyme, with a maid and the necessary funds, from the Ashbourne accounts, by Friday. Strake assented and left. A week after the dinner, by which time the Marquis was 3 days lodged in the Marshalsea, and the newspapers had begun to print the first cautious paragraphs about the company's investigations, the Duke came down to the kitchen garden to find Lillian. She was cutting parsley. The kitchen garden was walled in soft red brick, mellowed by 2 centuries of sun, and smelt of new mint and the first mid-May roses. Bees moved between the wallflowers. Beyond the wall, the orchard's fallen petals lay across the grass in pale drifts. She had walked here every morning since the dinner. The garden had become hers, in the slow way places do. Lillian was in a plain green walking dress and a borrowed apron, hair coming down at the back of her neck, a small basket on her arm, cutting parsley with scissors that wanted sharpening. She did not look up at the footsteps. She knew the dukes by now. "Edmund." "Lillian." She told him that Mrs. Halford had informed her no Duchess of Ashbourne had ever cut her own herbs. He answered that he should make a very poor Duchess of Ashbourne then. He stopped. The scissors stopped also. She had not, until the words were in the air, intended to say them. She looked at the scissors, not at him. Her cheeks went red, a thing she had thought she had outgrown at 15. She began to apologize. She should not have. He said her name. She insisted it had been a slip. He said her name again. She raised her eyes. He stood 2 paces from her, in the dark bronze coat he had worn the day she arrived. He was not smiling. He looked at her with a focused stillness, his eyes the color of fire, when only the deepest part of the log is left. "Lillian Marsh," he said. "If you can stand still for 30 seconds, I shall ask you to be the Duchess of Ashbourne now, and spare us both another month of pretending I have not been about to ask, since you spoke 6 pages of fraud at me from memory, and never once looked at the papers." She stood still. She found, with mild surprise, that she had no difficulty standing still at all. She began the word, hesitated. He told her to take her time. Edmund. I have, for a long time, made it my business to be a quiet, observant person in a corner of someone else's house. I do not know how to be the Duchess of any house. I have only just learned to eat hot soup at the head of a table. He answered that he was not asking the Duchess of Ashbourne to marry him. He was asking Lillian Marsh. She looked at him. She asked what Lillian Marsh did. He said he did not know yet. They were still finding out. A small silence. She gave him her answer 3 times. The 3rd time, clearly. Yes. He crossed the 2 paces. He did not immediately kiss her. He took the parsley basket from her hand, set it on the gravel with the scissors on top, and closed her hand in his, looking at her for a long moment, as though the looking itself was what he had come down for. Then he kissed her, very gently, in the warm kitchen garden. And Lillian, who had spent 5 years learning to take up no space at all, found that she had room to spare. When he stepped back, his hand was in her hair, where Anne would have despaired of him. He observed that he should have to write to his mother. Lillian answered that the dowager was in the morning room and already knew. He said his mother always knew. Lillian agreed. The dowager had told her yesterday she was not to allow him to drag the matter on past the 2nd week of May, because she had a guest list to attend to, and the orchard would not flower forever. "My mother," he said. "Your mother. She is impossible. She is glorious." He laughed. It was the first laugh she had heard from him, a real one, surprised, low, and it changed the shape of his face entirely. Lillian decided this one she would not file. She would keep it in the front, where she could find it without having to look. They were married 6 weeks later in the parish church beyond the kitchen gardens. The dowager wept twice, once during the vows, once during the wedding breakfast, both silently. Drake arrived in time for the cake. Anne, promoted to lady's maid the day after the dinner, dressed Lillian in cream silk, with a ruby pin in her hair as a private joke between bride and groom. Mrs. Halford, who had worn the face of disapproval for 5 days beforehand, was discovered weeping into the crockery during the toast. The Marquis was sentenced in the autumn to 14 years transportation. He went to Botany Bay. The case ruined 9 other houses and was the principal scandal of the parliamentary session. The East India Company gave a small silver inkwell to a clerk in Bristol who had never existed. A year after the wedding, on a warm afternoon in late April, Lillian Ashbourne sat in the library with south sun in long, warm bars across the reading table. The daffodils were in the kitchen jug on the side table. A thread of garden air carried wallflowers and early roses through the open window. On the 3rd shelf of the west wall, the buckram ledgers sat where she had first found them, though there were now 5, the new 2 bound in cream calf, each with a ruby silk thread through the binding hole. Her amber travelling cloak, lining resewn a year before, was folded on the chair beside her, She was writing in a small ledger of her own: household wages, the cost of the slates on the South Lodge, the pensions she had quietly settled on Anne's mother and on a former Rendlesham kitchen maid who had given evidence at the trial and lost her position. The ledger was not locked. The Duke of Ashbourne came in. He had a coffee cup in one hand and a letter from the Greek master in the other. He set the cup beside her, stood behind her chair, and read over her shoulder for a long, quiet minute. He laid one warm hand against the back of her neck, briefly, and watched her finish the column. He said her name. She said his. He observed she was still cataloguing frauds. She corrected. She was cataloguing pensions. He warned that Mrs. Halford would hate that. Lillian replied that Mrs. Halford was reconciled. She had wept at the wedding. He was told she still did not admit it. She did not, Lillian agreed, and Lillian did not press her. He rested his chin lightly on the top of her head. He smelt of bergamot and the open window. Somewhere below, the dowager could be heard organizing the spring flowers with the authority normally reserved for cavalry generals. Lillian set down her pen. She turned her head and looked up at him. She told him it was the 2nd week of May next week. He confirmed it. She added that Mrs. Halford had informed her no Duchess of Ashbourne had ever picked her own peas.
Mrs. Halford, said the Duke of Ashbourne, is going to be very busy this summer. He bent his head and kissed her, very gently, in the warm library, with the daffodils on the side table and the amber cloak on the chair. And Lillian Ashbourne, who once had stepped out of a Rendlesham carriage and said, "I am the payment," to a strange porter on a warm afternoon in April, found that she had not, in the end, paid anything at all. She had been received. If you have ever been in a house where you took up the smallest amount of space you could manage, and discovered, on a particular morning, but the room had been larger than you thought all along, tell me about it in the comments. And if you would like to come back to this fire next week, the kettle will be on. Subscribe so that you do not miss the door when it opens.